Today we're fortunate to have Daryl here, Daryl Copeland. Daryl is here actually on invitation of in Thailand. He served in Thailand many years ago, but he's back here on invitation of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Thailand, and he's been talking to young officials in the ministry. And Daryl has some very interesting thoughts on science, diplomacy, globalization, and the new threat set. And I think with his rich experience in talking to about reform with the Thai Foreign Ministry and lecturing in various institutions around the world on diplomacy and reforms and the way diplomacy has changed over the ages, and yet in some respects not changed at all. But there are tremendous lessons for this region. Not least of which is the challenge of managing disputes, including that in the South China Sea, which is very much the center of attention in some respects. So, Daryl, less said the better. Actually, your CV is extensive enough. Floor is yours. Thanks for coming back. Welcome back to FCCT.
Good evening, everybody. Listen, it's wonderful to be here. Wonderful to be back. Wonderful to see some familiar faces, including my very old friend Sean Brady, who I'm delighted came tonight. I think, folks, that the issue of security and development in the 21st century is probably the real sleeper of our times. And I'm going to offer you this evening an analysis, kind of a worldview, which proposes that in the age of globalization, development, by which I mean long-term, human-centered, equitable, and sustainable development, which certainly is no longer anything that we would limit to what was once called the Third World, that kind of development has become the basis for security. And by security, I refer to a situation in which the human person, that's you and I and everybody else, feels an absence of want, an absence of fear, and that their basic needs are met, and that they can, through their lifetime, approach something approximating their potential without running into inordinate constraints or obstacles. So in this conception, development and security, I'm going to argue, are indivisible. They become joined at the hip, fused. And if you accept that, the implications are quite far-reaching, not least for places such as Thailand in 2016. So let me start with a little story. It's a story of Albert Einstein, and he's one of my favorite science diplomats, but he also was somewhat of a philosopher, and I've got a couple of his sayings that I'd like to share with you in addition to the story. Perhaps the shortest and most profound was his observation that we can't solve the problems we've created with the same thinking that we used in creating them. And that strikes me as a really important observation when we're trying to chart the way forward from where we are today in our efforts to bring peace and prosperity to the planet, so far without much success, and where we want to be. So the story, in brief, is this. Einstein was teaching at Humboldt University in Berlin in the early 1920s, was an introductory first-year physics course. And as occasionally happens, one of the students failed and as a result had to repeat the course the year after. And on the occasion of the Christmas examination, when all the students gathered together in a large room to take the exam, when the appointed hour arrived for them to turn over their papers and look at the questions and start madly scribbling, with Einstein being the invigilator of the exam, the student who had failed the course the year before raised his hand and was desperately trying to get Einstein's attention. And he finally managed. And Einstein said, yes, what's the problem? And the student said, well, Professor, you're probably not aware of this, but I think that there's been a big mistake. And Einstein said, well, how's that? And the student said, well, I think I'm the only one in this room who wrote the Christmas exam last year, and if I'm not mistaken, these are the same questions as were on last year's exam. And there was a long moment of silence, and Einstein stared back coldly into the student's eyes and said, well, of course it's the same question. It's the answers that have changed. Now, why am I telling you that story? I'm telling you that story because it strikes me that the ends of diplomacy and international policy have always been, like the questions, the same. But as we've moved from the Cold War into the globalization age, what has changed is the answer. And the answer is that we can no longer get to security through defense. We can really only get there through development and diplomacy. So it was, for a long time, and I would argue in many places today, still very much believed that security is a martial art, that it's all about generals and admirals and bombs and guns and the application of armed force. In fact, if we're going to successfully broach the really critical issues of our age, it's going to be a new approach which is required. So the question, how do we get to security and development, peace and prosperity, remains the same, but the answer has changed. So diplomacy, I'm going to argue in general, and science diplomacy, which I'll describe in particular, I do believe are part of the solution, or at least a piece of the answer. But, and this is an important but, the methods, the institutions, and the practice of diplomacy have failed to keep pace with the changes in the operating environment, and as a result are failing to deliver the results that are required to successfully broach these issues. So I'd like to suggest that there are 5 features that encapsulate these changes in the operating environment, and these are the major challenges which I think science diplomacy can, but has not yet, responded to. The first is the march of globalization. And, we can easily become fairly blasé about globalization. It's one of those terms which is overused. But it strikes me as by far the most important historical process of our times. I think it's paradoxical. I think it's totalizing. I think it accelerates time. I think it compresses and deterritorializes political space in terribly important ways. I think it integrates while it fragments, and I think it connects while it differentiates. So it's multifaceted, it's cross-cutting, but it's not neutral. In fact, it's anything but. In fact, I think it's quite inextricably linked to neoliberal economics, and that means deregulation, privatization, free trade, and a whole laissez-faire package that is intended to reduce the role of government and enlarge the place of the private sector in just about all spheres of human activity. And we see this, I see this, everywhere that I look. So globalization, yes, it creates wealth, but not for all. It has a tendency to privatize benefits and socialize costs. It creates a deeper divide, sharper edges, winners and losers. It's great if you're on the receiving end of globalization, not so great if you're excluded. And whatever its virtues, and there are many, the greater connectivity, which is, I think, a hallmark of globalization, has really engendered a lot of mass anxiety, resentment, and alienation. Look only at the efforts initially of Al-Qaeda through Inspire and now through the Islamic State. Their use of the web for jihadi recruitment is quite extraordinary, and that also illustrates this deterritorialization of political space. You no longer have to be somewhere to join a community. So I think that this anxiety, resentment, alienation on globalization's underside, so if you're in a banlieue on the outside of Paris, if you're in a barrio, if you're in an export processing zone, diplomacy doesn't look quite as good as it might from a penthouse in Bangkok. The erstwhile global village, in fact, I think is these days looking really a lot more like a sort of modern-day Dickensian dystopia, with a smattering of gated green zones surrounded by a seething sea of shantytowns. Not a pretty picture. So the globalization age, how would we encapsulate it? Well, I like the acronym VUCA. V for volatile, U for uncertain, C for complex, and A for ambiguous. It makes it difficult to chart and navigate, but one of its hallmarks is the centrality of science and technology, and in particular the revolution in information and communication technologies, which has both facilitated international collaboration and increased polarization. It has also contributed materially to the reduced importance of states and borders. So, globalization, there's a lot that we could say about it, could talk for hours and hours about it, but I think that's sort of point number one that diplomacy hasn't really adjusted to. Diplomacy is still very much structured in such a way as to respond to the set of circumstances that prevailed in the previous historical era, the Cold War, and has yet to undertake the changes necessary to respond effectively to globalization. Point number two is about world order. I would put it under the heading of heteropolis rising. A lot of people believe that we're returning to some kind of multipolar world order. I think that's wrong. I much prefer the term heteropolar. The idea there is that the vectors and sources of power and influence in the 21st century are characterized more by difference than by similarity. The multipolar system is very much a 19th century construction. Think of Metternich, Castlereagh, Bismarck, Talleyrand, these guys who all knew each other, sat around the same tables, and although they each had different hands when it came time to negotiate, to try and balance power, their cards were all from the same deck. So again, the sources and vector power of an influence, I mean, they were the same. It was how big is your army, how much artillery do you have, how large is your navy, how big is your empire, what's the size of your economy, how large is your population. These were things that are easily measured and calibrated, so if you're trying to balance power, it's conceivable to do. In the heteropolis, which I see emerging all around us, that's impossible, because the sources and vectors of power are all different, and the poles are all different. You know, in the old multipolar system, the poles all looked the same. Again, the hands were different, but the cards were from the same deck. Today, we've got a lot of different decks, and we've got a lot of different types of poles. Some are states, some are groups of states, some are corporations, some are individuals, some are think tanks, some are private philanthropic organizations. The U.S., I would argue, is emerging as the world's Praetorian pole. It's the preeminent military power, but in very short order will no longer be the preeminent economic power. China, the world's manufacturer. India, the world's back office, call center, software incubator. Brazil, an agro-industrial powerhouse, notwithstanding its current problems, and the emerging voice of the global south. Russia, a kind of wild card, a kind of a petropole, behaving rather more like it did in the 19th century than the 20th. ASEAN, interestingly, with the increasing levels of integration that we're seeing in Southeast Asia, emerging as another type of pole, unlike any other. So What I'm saying here is that in this emerging heteropolis, the sources and vectors of everyone's power and influence are difficult, and that's going to make it extremely difficult to try and balance. And achieving that balance, unlike in the days of multipolarity, will never, ever be achieved through armed force. And I don't say that armed force may not play a role, but I don't think it will be determinant. In fact, I think that it's going to be diplomacy rather than defense that we're going to have to look to when sparks fly in this new heteropolitan world order under construction. Brings me to the third point about the transformed operating environment, and I would put that under the heading of power shift or shifting power, not least in response to globalization and heteropolarity. And in this regard, we've seen foreign ministries, and I spent 30 years working for one. We've seen that foreign ministries have lost a significant amount of their power and influence to central agencies, cabinet offices, executive branches of government, other government departments, finance ministries. And much has certainly been made of the emergence of the BRICS and the migration of the dynamic center of the global political economy from the North Atlantic to the Asia Pacific, and I certainly see that. We see that mirrored in institutions, from the Washington Consensus to the Beijing Consensus, from the G7 or G8 to the G20, from NATO to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, from the World Bank to the Asian Investment and Infrastructure Bank. Very interesting. I mean, things are really changing very profoundly in the world. And it's not just at that level. It's I think it's even more fundamental, because I think what we're looking at is the end of state centricity. I think that states are no longer the primary referent when we start to think about big issues like security and development, because power is shifting upwards to supranational institutions. It's shifting outwards to corporations, to NGOs, to private philanthropists like Bill Gates, to celebrities like Bono, who turns up in places like Davos and tells world leaders how to take decisions and run countries. I mean, this is something quite new. And power is also moving downwards to sub-state actors such as provinces, states, and increasingly, I think, to cities, which are probably the most underrepresented unit of political organization at the moment in what we sometimes call the international system. So power is always on the move, but it's moving particularly quickly now, and traditional diplomatic methods and tools have not taken account of this, and they need desperately to be supplemented by something less conventional and more innovative in terms of approaches to diplomatic practice. The fourth point, and I touched on this in my opening remarks, I think we are looking at an emerging nexus between diplomacy and two of the end states that it seeks to achieve. And in that I'm referring to these large notions of security and development. I think that there is an emerging security development nexus. I suggested that security is no longer, if it ever was, a martial art. And under the general heading of no justice, no peace, it strikes me that just as we're never going to get to security through bombs and guns, we're never going to get to development through aid programs and a kind of thinking that limits our conceptualization of diplomacy to what we used to call the third world and now call the global south. So they're really two sides of the same coin. I think they've become indivisible, are joined at the hip, and what they have in common is that the human person, rather than the state, is the primary referent. That's really what we're thinking of now when we think, or when I think anyway, about development and security. I don't think mainstream strategic thinking has really taken account of this, and it strikes me that in particular we didn't learn the enduring lesson of the Cold War, which is that militaries work best when they're not used. I mean, that was really, I think, the most important single lesson of the Cold War. You take the sword out of the scabbard, and it makes a terrible mess. So diplomacy, not armed force, I think, is the key to security and development. And by way of illustration, if you look at the recently accepted Sustainable Development Goals, all 17 of them have two things in common. They can't be achieved through armed force, and there's a big piece of science and technology requirement in each of the SDGs. The fifth point, and it's my segue into the discussion of science diplomacy, is that we've seen the ascendance of a set of global issues, which I put under the heading of the new threat set. And here, the point that I'd like to make is that it strikes me that the real challenges to human survival are not ideological rivalry or territorial ambition, as they were during the Cold War. They're not terrorism, religious extremism, or political violence, as those who are pursuing the global war on terror would wish you to believe. But instead, they are a set of global issues rooted in science, driven by technology. They're transnational in nature, and they can be thought of, I think, as having in common the fact that they cut all ways. So if you believe that one of these wicked issues, and that's a term that you'll find used frequently in the literature, cuts all ways, you can use CUTS as an acronym to describe these issues. C for complex or cross-sectoral or cross-cutting, U for unresolved, T for transnational, and S for science-based. Why is it that the ascendance of the new threat set has not been widely acknowledged? Why are governments most everywhere still investing the lion's share of their international policy resources in defense rather than diplomacy, notwithstanding the fact that the chance of anyone in this room being directly affected by a terrorist incident is considerably less than the likelihood of being hit by lightning or drowning in the bathtub? And that's the case. Why is it that defense, rather than diplomacy, remains at the center of international policy most everywhere, notwithstanding the fact that climate change is affecting and afflicting all of us, as is diminishing biodiversity, food and water insecurity, desertification, soil degradation, the challenge of managing the global commons, outer space, cyberspace, the seas, the forests, the polar reaches? This is already tremendously affecting all of our lives, and yet it's somehow, again, the sleeper issue, the one that is not spoken of, is not recognized. And I think that there's really three reasons, or at least there may be more, but the ones that occur to me, and they're all related to the fact that I think we've carried over a certain amount of psychological luggage from the Cold War into the globalization age, which has blinkered us. The first is our worldview remains binary, black and white, Manichaean, when really we need a more subtle and supple view that takes account of the multiple shades of gray that are out there. So during the Cold War, the black and white or the binary worldview had to do with capitalism and communism, the free world and the unfree world, and so on. You remember the old maps with the red and the blue. In the globalization age, the binary worldview is expressed in the West versus the rest, or as George Bush said, you're with us or with the terrorists. Again, no middle ground, no gray. So a binary worldview, a characterization of the threat, that's point two, as universal and undifferentiated. So communism is everywhere and it's all the same. Doesn't matter if it's in Nicaragua or Cuba or China or Russia or wherever. It's the red menace and it's threatening all of us. I think that terrorism is treated in much the same way, a universal and undifferentiated threat. Doesn't matter, is it Hamas, is it Hezbollah, is it Al-Qaeda, is it the Islamic State? Doesn't matter. There's only one way to respond, and the way that we responded during the Cold War, and this is point three, is unfortunately the same way as we're responding today, and that is by heavily militarizing international policy. During the Cold War, it was through containment, deterrence, mutually assured destruction. Today, in the midst of what we may no longer call the global war on terror, but I would argue certainly still is being pursued as such, it is the global, so everywhere and all the time, war, there's your militarization of international policy, on terror. So 3 pieces of psychological baggage carried over from the Cold War into the globalization age, I think, have really blinkered us and seriously impeded our ability to more accurately identify and broach this new threat set. Well, what's the implication of this? This devaluation of diplomacy and this militarization of international policy? Well, it strikes me as we need a worldview, W-O-R-L-D view, that is brought into keeping with the nature and drivers of the globalization age. But we also need a worldview, a W-H-I-R-L-E-D view, because globalization has thrown a lot of the old distinctions and our old assumptions and what we thought we knew into a blender. And if you just imagine all of those old models actually being tossed into a blender and it gets turned on high and they just get whirled around. I mean, when I walk around Bangkok, that's what I see. I mean, I see opulence that exceeds anything that I come across in Toronto, but when I walk to the University of Toronto to teach my class and I'm stepping over homeless people sleeping on gratings, I see conditions that remind me of what I used to think of as underdevelopment or the third world. So all of that old think just doesn't make sense anymore. So we need a world view and we need a world view. So I believe that there's no military solutions to these more profound threats that are imperiling life on the planet. And I think that the limitations of armed force just could not be clearer. You can't call in an airstrike on a warming climate. You can't garrison against pandemic disease. You can't send out an expeditionary force to occupy the alternatives to a carbon economy. It just won't work. So what do we do? How do we get from where we are to where we want to be? Because it strikes me as pretty obvious. Military force is both too sharp and too dull an instrument with which to treat the challenges of globalization. But it still attracts, again, the lion's share of resources and, as a result, the lion's share of taskings. And that imbalance, I think, should be a major political and public policy issue, but it's not. Which brings us to diplomacy and to science diplomacy. And look, I don't want to drone on for too long about this because I hope we can have a discussion. But, diplomacy really is something real, although many diplomats, I don't think, have thought very deeply about it. It's an approach to the management of international relations through nonviolent political communications. So it uses dialogue, negotiation, compromise, knowledge-based problem-solving, complex balancing, to try and deal with differences and to solve problems. And I think it's never mattered more, but it's underperforming because it has not adjusted to those 5 major changes that I tried to sketch in the operating environment. And it suffers from a substantial problem, which is that it is desperately in need of reform, but it's also got a very serious image problem. I mean, when most people think of diplomacy, they think of waste, inefficiency, they think of pinstripes and pearls, they think of people swanning around great global capitals at public expense. They think of dithering dandies hopelessly lost in a haze of irrelevance somewhere between protocol and alcohol. So I think, diplomacy has got a serious image problem as well as a substance problem. So I think we need to rethink and reform all elements of the diplomatic ecosystem. That means the foreign ministry, the foreign service, and the diplomatic business model. And I can get, if you like, in our discussion into just what I think would be required to make foreign ministries more effective, the diplomatic business model more relevant, and to transform foreign services so that they could start producing the sorts of results that governments require. But a lot of that has to do with public administration, so rather than dwell on that, the slightly more bureaucratic assessment of the need for reform, let me just go right into science diplomacy, because science diplomacy, it strikes me, is something which is almost unknown in mainstream society. The two words, science and diplomacy, don't sit together comfortably. A couple of nouns, they're rather strange bedfellows. And most folks, if you say the word science diplomacy in polite company or at conversation over a glass of wine at a dinner party, it's often enough to just stop the conversation dead in its tracks. Because diplomacy, as I said, suffers from this image problem, and science isn't far off. Science is the subject that most people wanted to drop in high school. Science is the thing that people just wanted to get away from. They think of having to memorize the periodic table or the parts of the cell, the endoplasmic reticulum, and so on. I mean, you know, science, physics, chemistry, biology, it was just something that most people, and certainly most people that work in foreign ministries, just wanted to put a lot of distance between themselves and the subject matter. So you combine the two, and it's a bit of a double whammy. But what I would like to suggest to you is that science and technology, expressed through their combination with diplomacy in this particular combination of science diplomacy, really need to become preoccupations for the people that make international policy and practice it, so that's the diplomats. And there's three reasons, which in a nutshell, well, it's that S&T drives globalization and those wicked issues upon which human survival, I think, will depend. Secondly, science and technology provide the keys to both security and development, and I explained why I thought those two interrelated concepts are terribly important. And thirdly, evidence-based policy and decision-making are the hallmarks of good governance and responsible public administration. So there's all kinds of good reasons to put science and technology front and center, and yet they're not. Almost everywhere, they're in the margins rather than the mainstream. Highly misunderstood. So when we do put that combination together, the science and the diplomacy, what do we actually mean in practice? Well, there's three elements. One is science in diplomacy. So that's the provision of high-level scientific advice to policy and decision makers so that they can actually start to grapple with these really complex issues in a more effective way than is the case at present. Second is the idea of science for diplomacy. So that's when you find international scientific cooperation supporting diplomatic objectives and or using science cooperation to improve international relations. We saw an awful lot of that during the Cold War. At times when international diplomatic channels were blocked, when communication was strained or non-existent, American and Russian scientists were still sitting around talking to each other at Antarctic ice stations or working on deep sea research or verification of arms control agreements. So lines of communication were kept open. They were kept open to North Korea. They were kept open to Cuba. They were kept open to Iran. And at times when regular channels of communication are not working, keeping those scientific channels open are terribly important. So that's the idea of science for diplomacy. And the third aspect is diplomacy for science. So that's when the diplomats get together and try and advance scientific objectives. So think here of the Kyoto process and the COP meetings. Think of environmental and arms control treaties. Think of the Montreal Protocol on ozone level depletion. Think of the Rio Conference, or also known as the UN Conference on Environment and Development. Think of the recent agreement between Iran and the P5 plus Germany on the kind of regularization or demilitarization of their nuclear program, and think of the incredible breakthrough in 2013 when international weapons inspectors supervised the decommissioning of the weapons of mass destruction program in Syria as a result of Mr. Kerry's a completely unexpected answer to a question posed by a journalist at a press conference, which was to say, Secretary Kerry, is there anything that might stop you from sending cruise missiles into Syria? And he said yes, if they dismantled their chemical weapons program. And the next day, Sergei Lavrov was in Damascus announcing that Syria was prepared to go along with that. Really extraordinary. But that was a very good example of diplomacy engaging to advance scientific goals or objectives or outcomes. So the comparative advantage, I think, of science diplomacy is that it combines the political agency or the capacity of diplomacy with the evidence-based problem-solving and decision-making capacity of science. That means it's an ideal instrument to address those wicked issues that I spoke of, and it's a universal kind of non-ideological enabler of international communications, which is particularly useful when those more conventional channels are blocked. So listen, that's all very promotional. If science diplomacy is so great, why is it that we're not really seeing much of it, and why is it that probably quite a few people in this room have never even heard the term before? Well, here's the rub. Well, the case for science diplomacy is strong. The capacity to do it is extremely weak. In fact, S&T capacity is largely alien to and almost invisible within most institutions of global governance. So whether it's foreign ministries or development agencies or multilateral organizations, they're typically without the scientific expertise, the technological savvy, or the cultural predisposition, or for that matter, the research and development network access required to bridge digital divides and manage these S&T driven issues very effectively. Moreover, while R&D and innovation tend to thrive in lateral, interconnected, and network settings, in most diplomatic services and international organizations, what do we see? We see bureaucratic sclerosis, we see rigid occupational hierarchies, and we see very authoritarian social relations, and these are not conditions in which innovation can thrive. So we've got these shortcomings and these capacity gaps, and they're compounded, in my view, by three even larger challenges. One is that S&T is not always on the side of the angels. Yes, it's a crucial contributor to security and development, but also of insecurity and underdevelopment, of suffering, of exploitation, of war and devastation. So S&T cuts all ways. Secondly, it's this image problem. You take science and people's idea of science and their memories of high school and diplomacy, and this is the dithering dandies who are hopelessly lost. You put the two of those together, and it's a devastating combination. And thirdly, and probably most important when it comes to a practical analysis, the worlds of science and diplomacy are floating. They're separate. They're effectively two solitudes. Just ask yourself, how many diplomats are scientists? How many scientists are diplomats? How often do scientists and diplomats get together and talk? If they do get together and talk, can they understand each other? Because they speak almost different languages. Scientists tend to be notoriously bad communicators, and diplomats tend to be profoundly unfamiliar with science. So we've got a major problem here, I would argue, that the culture and values of the two worlds are quite profoundly divergent. Just think about this. Diplomacy largely about stability and balancing power, science about change and unleashing power. This is by way of illustrating the contrasting worlds. Diplomacy about convention or conventions, like the Vienna Conventions on Diplomatic and Consular Relations, and conventional behavior. You know, diplomats, the kind of the quintessential conventional figures, whereas science is about experimentation rather than convention. Diplomacy very much about risk aversion, science about risk tolerance, diplomacy about the world of practice and the practical, science about theory and the world of the theoretical, diplomacy about argument, so tact, discretion, persuasion, influence, science about facts and data, diplomacy about negotiation and compromise, science about trial and error, diplomacy about the political, science about the empirical, and finally, diplomacy being practiced in the polis and science being practiced in the laboratory. And the polis and the lab are far, far, far apart. So for these reasons and more, it strikes me that science and diplomacy and scientists and diplomats, though they're rarely seen to be getting along, really need to spend more time together. They might consider some counseling, and they really need a fix. There are some examples that I could give you of best practices in science diplomacy. I think I would save those for our Q&A, but I think one of the fundamental obstacles is that people in foreign ministries tend to think of the foreign ministry as a cathedral, they think of the foreign service as a priesthood, and they think of diplomacy as liturgy, sort of a standard operating procedures that you can follow anywhere and everywhere. Scientists, for their part, they tend to fear that their work will somehow be contaminated if they take it outside of the lab, and they desperately need to increase their awareness, I think, of global issues and to better somehow contextualize their skills and experience in the sense of embracing these larger public policy and political roles and issues that I have touched on. So how do we otherwise get science and technology from the margins into the mainstream of diplomacy and international policy? How do we bridge these solitudes? Well, if you think of these floating worlds of diplomacy and international policy on one hand and science and technology on the other as contained within spheres, and you're looking for an image, think of bringing the spheres together. Think of a Venn diagram where you get an area of overlap between these otherwise floating worlds. Well, that area in the Venn diagram where the two spheres come together is the sweet spot, the elusive sweet spot that I think we've got to focus on. How do we get there? What's the construction advice? Well, we talked about embedding more diplomatic capacity through radical reform of all elements of the diplomatic ecosystem. I think that's absolutely fundamentally important. How do we do that? Well, we turn the inside out, we bring the outside in, because inside the cathedral the air gets very stale. There's a tremendous need for ventilation and cross-fertilization. We can think in terms of creating specialties within people that work in organizations like the UN specialized agencies or any foreign ministry. An S&T specialty stream. We've got people that specialize in economics, in commerce, in trade, in investment, in public affairs, in political analysis. Why don't we have people that specialize in S&T in most of these organizations? Well, we don't, but I think we need to. We can experiment with new ways of doing diplomatic business. We can do open source policy development and problem solving. We can use the social and digital media much more extensively than has been the case. At the moment, we can encourage cooperation between government and the private sector and civil society. How do we do that? Well, we create lateral interconnected networks, and we go beyond the usual suspects to form partnerships with some of these strange bedfellows, so venture capitalists, small and medium-sized industry, private philanthropic organizations. And we ensure the availability of high-quality scientific advice where it's needed most. So not just in foreign ministries, but in parliaments, in legislatures, in places where decisions are made, where science at the moment just isn't present. So it's a very tall order. It's a very tall order. And I get discouraged sometimes, and when I do, I think about something which gives me a bit of solace, and that is that there is one common, if unappreciated, objective that scientists and diplomats, science and diplomacy share, and that's that although these worlds are different and quite disparate, both scientists and diplomats seek to use understanding and reason and rational process to bring order and structure and systemic formulation to otherwise disparate and disorderly realms. So they share that. So I hope and I think that science, diplomacy can and must build on that shared interest. After all, mutual interest is the mother of the best cooperation. And a start might be to construct a new narrative for science diplomacy. You know, diplomacy needs a new narrative itself. It's profoundly unsexy. So we need to we need to improve the story, and I think that we might be able to do that again by bringing it into the present. People talk about twiplomacy when they talk about digital diplomacy and use of the new media. Maybe it's time to start talking about skiplomacy or skyplomacy, where we bring diplomacy and science closer together. But at minimum, and this is really, I think, fundamental, we've got to recognize that there is a dialectic relationship between results and resources when we talk about diplomacy. Science diplomacy, traditional diplomacy, public diplomacy, guerrilla diplomacy, about which I've written a book. And that's that if we don't demilitarize international policy and reinvest in diplomacy in general and science diplomacy in particular, our diplomatic capacity is going to remain underwhelmed, and improving that capacity through reinvestment, I think, is the sine qua non to improve performance. So let me just wrap up with this. I think the idea of science underlies much of what I've been saying, this notion that an evidence-based form of knowledge acquisition really underscores some important principles. For example, that all events are caused, that misery is not fated, that poverty and suffering are not intrinsic parts of the human condition. And listen, in a world of extremist violence, of infotainment, of bundled derivatives and voodoo economics, I think science shines pretty brightly. Endless wars, threat conjuring, terror alerts, the fomenting of the politics of fear, that we should all be afraid, be very afraid. These are part of the problem, not the solution, in my view. I think a more lasting and effective approach would be to address the new threat set that I sketched by mobilizing science diplomacy in support of human security and broadly based sustainable development. And in that dispensation, science and diplomacy would truly become a preoccupation of both diplomacy and international policy. I think it's long past time that governments and international organizations reconsidered their priorities and reallocated their resources accordingly. So, in a nutshell, that's my thinking about why, in the age of globalization, diplomacy in general and science diplomacy in particular must displace defense at the center of international policy. Absent that, getting from insecurity and underdevelopment to security and development, peace and prosperity will remain elusive, if not impossible. So thank you for listening. I'm sorry I droned on a bit too much. I usually like to do things in a kind of a more Socratic way, but I had a lot that I wanted to share with you. So for that, I apologize, but happy to take questions, comments, and particular, I like criticism.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We need a mic out there. So if you have questions, please. We have a wireless mic which can go around. And please identify yourself and your affiliation, if any. Put up your hand. You got a question there? Yeah, please go ahead, sir. Is it on?
Sean Brady, no particular affiliation. Oh, I'm with Canadian Chamber. We both are. Daryl, I was wondering, how are you going to start sourcing different people for foreign ministries, HR guys, that sort of thing? right now the kind of people that they're looking at for foreign ministries, as you said, dropped all the physics and that sort of thing in high school and have no concept whatsoever. So, and how's everybody going to start doing that at the same time? And as the Thai MFA, have they been reacting positively to your suggestions?
Yeah, thank you, Sean. The bureaucratic part that I skipped over dealt with these issues of human resources and so on. I think the problem with foreign ministries is that there's way too much corporate cloning that goes on. People that have succeeded under the situation of the status quo feel that it's got to be other people like them that are always going to succeed as well, and that means that when it comes to recruitment and promotion, they're looking for those that are just like them. So there's, as you well know, a great sameness within these institutions, and they tend to become rather unrepresentative and also very brittle and sclerotic and not very flexible and extremely change resistant and conservative. So it's a tall order. I like the idea of bringing the outside in and turning the inside out. For example, Sean, I would, and this doesn't go over very well with the folks at home, as a precondition to entry to the executive level or being posted abroad as a head of mission, I would have the demonstrated capacity to work effectively outside the foreign ministry or the international organization as a prerequisite to advancement. So, that I think would weed out a lot of those who tend to thrive by drinking the Kool-Aid, but we need a whole new approach to recruitment. I like the model of the backpack diplomat. That's what my guerrilla diplomacy piece is a lot about. I think that through world travel, grassroots experience in an NGO, and so on, you develop a skill set that you can't acquire in the finest Ivy League university. And I'm a big fan of formal knowledge acquisition. I spend a lot of my time teaching at universities. But what you can't learn in a university is what you can learn if you're on the road doing world travel. And here I'm talking about self-sufficiency, self-reliance, survival skills, problem solving, cross-cultural communication capacity, all the stuff that you need to get along successfully in the world of independent, low-level, grassroots type of travel. So that's where the model of the backpack diplomat comes from, and I'd be hiring a lot more of those people because they can be effective in places where we've got to be doing diplomacy these days. So in the souk, in the barrio, in the favela, in the conflict zone. We need folks that are comfortable outside the bubble. We need people that can swim like a fish in the sea of the people rather than flop around like a fish out of water. I can't tell you how many times I've been on calls with my boss, the head of mission, and their greatest fear is that the ambassadorial car would break down in the wrong place and they'd actually go out there and have to mix it up with the locals. They're a lot more comfortable talking with people who dress and look and think like them about what might be going on outside than they are with actually getting out of the car, getting out of the bubble, and going out and finding out for themselves. So we've got too many international policy bureaucrats, not enough diplomats, change has got to come because I think the profession is so underperforming at the moment that it's facing a threat to its survival if it doesn't embrace this change and reform. So yes, Sean, it is a very tall order, but I think there's no alternative.
Yeah, good point. Any more questions? Okay. Good.
My name is Perth. I'm a student here, and I was wondering if you thought there were any inherent opponents to science diplomacy that would have to be managed by the Cold War methods of defense.
I'm sorry. Do I think that there are any issues that cannot be treated successfully through diplomacy? And yeah, well, look, yes, I'm not a pacifist. I think there is a role for the military. I happen to think that the role is bloated at the moment, that it's been exaggerated, and because they get the lion's share of the resources, they get the lion's share of the taskings. Why is it that we're using the military to do international humanitarian assistance and disaster relief? Well, it's because they've got all the kit. Well, why do they have all the kit? Well, they've got all the kit because they've got the budgets, so they attract the taskings. But, surely custom-built civilian organizations could do a better job at stuff like humanitarian assistance and disaster relief than organizations that are designed to kill and capture enemies. I mean, really, that's why we have militaries. I think that there is this profound misallocation of resources, but I'm not saying do away with defense departments and do away with armies. I mean, I don't think we could have negotiated with Hitler, for example. But by the same token, I don't think that pursuing the problem of the Islamic State by trying to bomb them into oblivion is the answer. I would take the billions of dollars that are being used to level places like Ramadi and Fallujah and Raqqa, and I would instead drop billions of dollars out of aircraft all over the battlefield. And what would happen? Well, people would drop their weapons and start picking up the money. What would they do with the money? Well, they'd do some grocery shopping, they'd buy clothes, they'd send their kids to school, they'd maybe start a business. I think that, that's a better path to de-radicalization than creating more martyrs. There's not a diplomatic solution to everything, and there is a role for the military. But frankly, we're so far off at the other end of the spectrum from where I think we need to be that it's almost as if we really have no alternative other than to embrace this new thinking and really reform pretty radically.
The lady here. Could you have the lady first? Yeah. Go ahead. Okay.
Mark Harris, I'm a club member. I'd like to take issue with you on where you started, which was talking about the tremendous changes we're facing. History is made of change and also continuity, and I think you're failing to stress the continuities that are present in international diplomacy at the moment. If you look at Europe and what's been happening with Putin in the Ukraine and Crimea, if you look at Turkey and the way it's trying to use its leverage to gain bargaining chips out of Western European countries, if you look at the squabbles between European powers, with many of those things being underlined by petty nationalisms, I see things that would be very common not just to 20th but to 19th century diplomats. Also, if you look at what's happening in the South China Sea, the type of territorial dispute, and again there's a lot of underlying nationalism, that looks to me like the same sort of colonial disputes that occurred between the great powers in the late 19th century. And when we have a blow up in the South China Sea, it's important that the diplomats studied the Fashoda crisis rather than science and technology. So how would you say about the continuities that exist in diplomacy? Because to me they're evident in many of the challenges that are currently being faced.
I don't really differ with you, and I apologize if you are left with the impression that I've got this sort of sense that there's a panacea and one size fits all. I would actually say that, of course, there's at least as much continuity as there is change when we look at these threats and challenges, and there will always be a role for traditional diplomacy. So yes, it's true that my reading of the overall trends is that we're likely to need more public diplomacy and more science diplomacy if we're going to cope with the new threat set. It's not that the old threats aren't still there. Yes, there is still territorial ambition. Yes, there still are ideological differences in the world. Yes, there still are great power politics. I don't see those threats and challenges at the moment as being on my A list. I mean, compared to what's happening to the world's pool of biodiversity and how quickly we're losing it, or how rapidly we're being overwhelmed by the challenge of the changing climate, or advancing deserts, or degrading soil resources, or what we're doing to marine life in the world's oceans, the ungoverned nature of outer space and cyberspace and the militarization of everything. I mean, it strikes, the militarization of society, the militarization of the police function. I mean, we've got these, really very, very large problems that are affecting all of us very front and center. So I'm not saying that the more traditional elements that have always preoccupied diplomats and historians are inconsequential or going away. I would just say that we haven't taken sufficient account of these new developments, and if we don't, it's at our peril.
Thank you. The lady here?
Hello, May from the Stockholm Environment Institute. I wanted to follow up on the initial question the gentleman over there posed. A lot of the solutions you offer are from the developed countries' perspective. They're backpacker diplomats, the delivery of high-level information. What about from the critical country that needs the donor or development agencies' assistance? What do you think that their foreign ministries should do, and what do you think that, what should they do from their perspective to get in this science policy or science diplomacy field?
I'd like, I mentioned the idea of partnership. I'd like to see science academies in places like North America and Western Europe reach out to new partner organizations in the global South. I think that there's a lot of capacity that can be built. I think there's a lot of capacity that can be shared. There are some interesting things going on. South Africa has been very active in this field. They've hosted meetings of the BRIC science ministers, for example. They're doing some really fascinating stuff. Brazil's doing some interesting things. Indonesia's doing some interesting things. So I do take your point, and I'm very sensitive to the criticism that this approach is kind of either Western centric or developed world centric or something like that. But that's, that observation in itself is not enough to undermine my enthusiasm for the message, because it strikes me that the case is really so strong. So in the case of the Global South, I would advocate international scientific cooperation. I would advocate reaching out. I would favor any kind of programs which would assist in transferring capacity and expertise to where it's needed. And some of this is going on. Again, globalization really is changing everything. We used to talk about the brain drain. Now we talk a lot about brain circulation. And talent is incredibly mobile. What I would like to see is more of a focus at a high policy level on these kinds of challenges, so that we could really begin to broach them more effectively. But what I really see is that these issues are being ignored. So I'm not saying that you haven't put your finger on something important. I think it is, but it's a bit like the other gentleman's question, what about the old threats? They're there. But honestly, my analysis is just that our needs at the moment are so overwhelming, and our response has been so weak and pathetic, that rather than worry about some imbalance in capacity, I would just like to see a wholesale shift in our thinking about this stuff, so that we could really begin to address the underlying issues, which at the moment just isn't happening.
I'd like to, I'll just cut in with a quick question. I'm keen on your thoughts on the role of the media. And you said, of course, that the foreign diplomats see themselves as a priesthood. You could say the same for science. And media has always had a problem sort of trying to translate what's going on in those two worlds. And partly it's a problem of the scientists and the diplomats themselves who don't know how to be good communicators. But do you think, and of course in recent years we've seen this explosion of information and inherently, of course, an explosion of misinformation. Just keen on your view on whether the media helps or hinders what you're talking about, a new sort of paradigm, so to speak.
Yeah, it's often said that one of the few mature pleasures of adulthood is learning to sort of live with ambiguity and paradox and uncertainty. And I don't know if the media helps or hinders. I think in a way the media helps and hinders. If it bleeds, it leads. If it's complex, it's on the back pages if it gets covered at all. There's not a whole lot of science journalism out there. And yet, I can say from my own experience, often my best contacts have been journalists. Journalists have access to information and networks that diplomats don't. One of the things that I regret about the rise of digital diplomacy and in the parallel universe of journalism, the fact that anybody with a handheld digital device has suddenly become a reporter, is that professional journalism has taken a real hit. Foreign bureaus have been closed, foreign correspondents have been fired, and the international content in the mainstream media has fallen off a cliff. As an analyst, I really regret that because all of the stuff that journalists have been trained to do, which is follow a story, use balance, use judgment and discretion, objectivity, try and get at the truth. These are really important things, and they tend to bring diplomats and journalists together in many places. And I noticed in my last couple of postings something really important, which was that all the guys that I not only used to drink beer with, but used to have serious discussions with, just weren't there anymore. So the role of the media, I think it's cross-cutting. There's on the one hand, there's been a loss, and there's a tendency to sensationalize, and there's infotainment and all that stuff. But on the other hand, good journalism serves great public purpose, and I hate to see it in retreat in the same way that I hate to see diplomacy so poorly performing in the face of these new challenges. So again, not help or hinder, but help and hinder, not good or bad, but good and bad.
Good, thank you. We have time for another couple of questions. One over there? Yeah, please go ahead.
I'm Mishari Mukbil of Travel Impact Newswire. I have two questions. The first question is data journalism. Are you familiar with the concept, and do you feel that this will be an opportunity for the diplomatic world to be exposed to and start having discussions more based on data and evidence in a way that is relatable to the general society? And my second question is regards to open source and other open medium. We see, for example, in Twitter, constantly people talking about airstrikes and whether it was an American airstrike or a Russian airstrike, and we have various anonymous analysts who are releasing all this information out there. But also we have places like Wikipedia where scientists and other people come in and even shape discussions and discourse. So I'm wondering if these two, data journalists as well as this entire open space, is having any impact in diplomacy at all, and how do you see this shaping out into the future?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think you put your finger on a couple of really important developments. I have not heard of data journalism, but last December in New York, I did attend a workshop on data diplomacy. And it's all about the use of big data to try and inform policy and decision making. All I can really say about that is, although we are in very early days, I mean, these are quite preliminary, we're in a really early position when it comes to even thinking about how we can use big data. There's no doubt that's kind of where the center of analytical gravity seems to be shifting towards. So data mapping, data visualization, the use of increasingly sophisticated software programs to analyze and treat these enormous data sets. This is really coming into sharper relief, and I think it's likely to be, as I said, I'd not heard the term data journalism, but I'm sure it will be of as enormous importance to journalism as it will be to diplomacy. So my comment there would be, I think that's a ball that we've really got to try and keep our eye on. Could you just give me a little bit more on your second question so that I could try and process it a bit further? Because I'm not sure that I quite got it.
Okay, sure. Well, it starts off with the basis of science and somewhat the scientific process, right? Where you have a hypothesis and you start you create a model and you have evidence pro and against it. And with the world of data and all the information that's opening up on the internet, science is no longer in the labs, but Joe Public can come up with a hypothesis, propose a model, and find data and have discussions based on available data on whether that conforms to the model or not. And often I've noticed that it has come into play with, for example, when either Russia or the United States bomb a location, there seems to be analysts using open source data proposing a hypothesis of whether the airstrike was actually done by, say, the Russians or American-backed rebels or something like that. But it's this entire concept of open data, because diplomacy, I understand, has traditionally been a fair bit, has been based on controlling data and actually controlling discourse.
And controlling information and secrecy,
correct,
yeah.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
But then now when all this is in the open, it also, I'm not sure whether it becomes a useful tool for diplomacy, or does it actually undermines the work of diplomats?
Yeah, no, but again, I think this is a case of not either or good or bad, but it's really both. I mean, yes, it's having an impact on the old model. It's helping blow the sides off it. Just in the same way that as they're firing correspondents and we see more and more, newscasts featuring this grainy handheld video of a tsunami or an earthquake or an airstrike or whatever, this open source stuff is definitely changing the way that we're doing diplomacy. I think that the WikiLeaks Cablegate episode was a really good example of this. I think that was a kind of a Napster moment for government. I think the message there was that it's impossible to keep secrets, that we'll never stay, governments will never succeed in staying very far ahead of advancements in technology. And as a result, it's going to be a lot more difficult to do things the old way. Is that good or bad? Well, it's probably good and bad. I mean, as a result of the publication of that 250,000 diplomatic cables, diplomatic tradecraft took a hit. Some sensitive sources were exposed. Diplomats were excluded from high-level confidential conversations because the interlocutors didn't want the content of their exchange to be featured on the front pages. On the other hand, the public's right to know was probably advanced, and an over-reliance on secrecy was probably retarded. So good or bad, I'd say good and bad. very cross-cutting, very mixed, but that's just part of the new landscape.
And sorry, just as an extension to that, are we starting to see diplomatic efforts now actually actively using open source sources or mediums in order to further the discussion or towards diplomatic aims?
Increasingly, I would say yes, and inevitably so.
All right, thank you.
Right. Okay, another question.
Hi, sorry, I'm Laura with the FCCT, but I'm also embarking on a master's in international development. So my question actually may be a bit Western-centric and specifically Canadian-centric, but as we're coming out of the Harper area...
Are you Canadian?
Yes, I am. Yeah, I'm from Nova Scotia. Hi. As we're coming out of the Harper era and we're going into the, well, as it's been lauded, the new era of Trudeau, do you think that Canada now has the diplomatic will to actually get back our place in development, in the development world, whether it be science-based, traditional-based development, as you know, we've been, let's say, scaling back, to put it diplomatically. Do you think with Justin Trudeau at the helm, I've been seeing just skimming the news, more and more and more and more money, commitment, just flat-out political will. Do you think the political will is there now for Canada to possibly be a lead in something like a science-based diplomacy?
I think that so much capacity was lost under the onslaught of the Harper years that there's a huge amount of build back that would be required before we could really begin to talk about any kind of restoration of kind of the old Canadian brand, where we were seen as a source of good ideas, a generous aid donor, a provider of good offices, an honest broker, a helpful fixer, Boy Scout to the world, and all that stuff. I mean, they fired thousands of scientists. They shrunk the foreign ministry. They shrunk our aid program to, the bottom of the OECD pile. And I think that the new government has taken some encouraging steps, but the jury is still out. I did a long segment with Michael Enright on Sunday Report on CBC Radio, which you could podcast if you want. I think it was broadcast just this weekend, where we spent 40 minutes talking about all of this stuff. And you might find that helpful, I don't know. So is Canada back? Justin is very fond of saying Canada's back, Canada's back. I'd say maybe. But we'll just have to see. I mentioned the relationship between results and resources. A lot of reinvestment has got to be made. A lot of lost capacity has got to be restored. So we'll see. The fact that CETA was amalgamated with Foreign Affairs has caused such indigestion that there's still a lot of very serious problems on Sussex Drive in Ottawa. I was just in there a couple of weeks ago at a kind of a deep think on public diplomacy, and the place seemed as dysfunctional as ever, if not more so, notwithstanding the change in political leadership. And there's always a lag between expressed intent and then what actually happens down in the bowels of the bureaucracy. So I'm hopeful that things will improve. I think there's been some encouraging signs, but it's early days yet.
Okay, right. Okay, last question. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Franz from Heinrich Böll Foundation. So, what is your take on overlapping multilateral institutions? Because earlier you mentioned about G20 and ASEAN, and we see the fact that Indonesia, for example, a part of ASEAN, also part of G20, as well as with Vietnam and Malaysia, part of ASEAN, and also the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So, how does science diplomacy can fit this kind of overlapping institutions? Thank you.
I can, be perfectly frank. I've never thought about that, but it would strike me that having this overlap could be an important structural advantage for countries that find that they have a number of fora in which they can play simultaneously. Now, it's going to be a challenge to manage that, because you're going to need a higher level of policy integration and coordination. But, you know, again, one of the things that I didn't get to in my talk, because you can only cover so much, is that I would like to see foreign ministries shed a lot of their very particularistic responsibilities and serve as central agencies for the management of exactly that kind of whole of government international policy integration that needs to be pulled together in one place if it's going to be coherent. And I don't see that happening right now. I see foreign ministries still, you know, struggling in the weeds, tussling with other government departments and international organizations about who's got the lead on files, a lot of really petty stuff, diverting valuable and scarce resources from the problems that they're intended to be resolving. So in the case of this multiple overlapping thing, I wouldn't necessarily see that as a disadvantage, except that it's a management challenge, and if we don't rise to that challenge by rethinking and reorganizing the way we do foreign policy and structure our foreign ministries, then it could end up hurting and hindering rather than helping. So the flip side of that, which is that you can turn adversity into opportunity by working smarter, would be my preferred option.
Okay, on that note, we'll call a halt to this. Fascinating. Thank you very much. It's so nice to have you back. It's really great, and it's very nice that the FCCD has, because we've been around so long, we have this sort of alumni, so to speak, around the world, and once in a while they find their way back to Bangkok. Thanks a lot, and have a great rest of your trip in Bangkok. And thank you for coming tonight.
Yes, thank you, folks, for listening. GuerrillaDiplomacy.com or Daryl.Copeland@GuerrillaDiplomacy.com if you want to continue the conversation. I do answer email, and if you like this stuff, you'll find that I've written a lot, and it's all up on the site, and it's all accessible online, and it's all free, so help yourselves.
Great.